Okay, Dr. Mather, welcome to the podcast. It's really good to connect.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we've just been having a brief chat off air about how to pronounce your surname and sort of getting to know one another a little bit. Are you happy to start before we dive into our topic today of kind of the gut and the thyroid and the connection between the two? You happy just to share with our listeners a little bit about who you are and how you've got to where you are?
I think that would be really helpful because I think my answers to the question will be more clear if they understand where I come from. Yeah, my name is Joe Mather. I'm the medical director of the Ruscio Institute for Functional Medicine. And I came to be here after a career in conventional medicine where I finished my training and really became frustrated that I felt like I was sold a bag of goods because I went into medicine to help my patients, lose their disease and feel better. And I was doing all of the guidelines from the American Diabetic Association and the American Heart Association and giving the newest medications, and surprised that, they weren't getting better. And so I found functional medicine shortly after my training, dove in and practiced functional medicine. And the more functional medicine I practiced and learned, the better my patients got. And eventually found the work of Michael Ruscio, who's got an excellent podcast. And particularly when I started applying Michael's concepts about gut health in my patients really started to take off. And the patients who had struggled, particularly, my first case that I really worked hard with his model was a case of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And this poor gal, I had put her through the ringer, the elimination diets and iodine and nutrients and all the rest of it. And she was not better until I really, really worked on her gut. And when that happened, the case turned around. And since then, dozens of similar cases. And it really convinced me that gut health is the centerpiece to getting so many of these patients better. And when I first started using integrative and functional medicine, I was convinced that conventional medicine was really harming patients because of the body of scientific knowledge and evidence that they were just ignoring, it seemed like, right? The lifestyle, the natural therapies, the nutrients, all of these things were being missed. And I was saying, God, this is incredible that conventional medicine is really harming patients by not doing these simple things. It fixes our patients. As I've practiced more and more in functional medicine, I've come full circle a little bit and have become frustrated because I see a lot of the common practices in functional medicine harming patients. In particular, we're seeing patients who come in and they've been treated by, a half dozen integrative practitioners, and they've spent tens of thousands of dollars on unvalidated lab tests, right? They've wasted years and they're not better. And so there are some areas where functional medicine really needs to improve, because I think some of the practices in functional medicine are quickly outdated and doing harm to patients. If we're here to help patients, we can't be wasting their time and money on things that just don't pan out. So that's maybe a brief introduction of kind of where we are. So practice conventional medicine, integrative medicine, and now as the medical director of the Ruscio Institute, we're trying to chart a slightly different path, right? Where can we take the best of evidence-based knowledge and apply that to the natural medicine world? So we're publishing papers. We've got a research arm of the clinic that we're very excited about. And we treat patients, trying to give practical, simple functional medicine. So that's the basics of kind of where I am. And happy to just answer any questions you have.
Yeah, I think, blending the two together is such a powerful way to move forward, rather than thinking of them as two kind of almost polar opposites.
Yeah.
It is all about integrating it fundamentally. And you've spoke about the importance of the gut within health, ultimately, no matter what topic we're talking about. I guess moving into the topic of today, the gut-thyroid axis, should we start by actually just sort of breaking this down? Like, what is the gut-thyroid axis? What do we mean by it? And where is our current understanding of what actually connects these two supposedly sort of different body sites?
Absolutely. So when I think of gut-thyroid axis, I think of the gut as the primary driver that's going to most quickly change thyroid function. And it simply is in my experience, the gut is the easiest system to change, right? You can swallow capsules and it goes right where you would like to treat it, right? It's not like, you kind of have to work to treat the adrenal gland or the spleen. They're kind of hidden, right? But if you just put something in the gut, or if you don't put anything and have someone fast, right, you're changing the gut. And what we find is time and time again, when we have patients with autoimmune disease, with chronic inflammatory conditions, rheumatic conditions, when they have thyroid disorder, when we simply treat the gut, the thyroid changes. And it's because of the complex interplay between the trillions of bacteria in the gut, the microbiome, and the immune system, which is intimately associated with the gut. Those two pieces are just phenomenally complex, but the best way to change those, in my experience, is working with the gut, right? Treating dysbiosis, using probiotics, changing diet, fasting. There are very simple tools that make profound changes in the immune system. And when you make profound changes in the immune system does its job everywhere, including the thyroid.
Perfect. And are there any other mechanisms, I guess, apart from sort of the immune system being sort of almost the middleman within this? And I'm just thinking, I stumbled across a paper, just doing a bit of preparation for our conversation, talking around kind of how the microbiome can influence nutrient status, things like zinc, iodine, iron, and these nutrients obviously being so paramount for thyroid function. So it looks like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from a research perspective, there's some research around kind of how nutrients via what's going on in the guts can influence thyroid function. Is that true as well?
It is true. I think the nutrient piece is a slightly lesser piece than one I'll mention in just a second, but It is without a shadow of a doubt, the microbiome is symbiotic when it comes to nutrient stores in the body, and that the human organism is not made to create or absorb every single nutrient. And so a lot of these nutrients, we rely on our microbiome to do the heavy lifting for us, right? The conversion of some of the sulfates, vitamins like K2 in particular that are hard to come by. We do rely on the gut to help us improve our nutrient status. Some of the jobs that we're just not evolved to do, we can rely on the bacteria to do the hard work for us. So that's where they can be our friends. Maybe a more direct mechanism that might be interesting for thyroid function is what we often see is when we take someone and they are hypothyroid and on thyroid replacement and they come into our clinic, and most of those folks, or a high amount of those folks, have significant GI symptoms. When you fix the GI symptoms, all of a sudden, within a short period of time, in a matter of weeks, typically, they need less thyroid medicine, right? So there comes a point where we fix their GI symptoms, and all of a sudden they're not sleeping well, and they're anxious, and they're irritable, right? And their thyroid dose is too high. And what's happened here is that the imbalance in the microbiome, we call it dysbiosis, right? The amount of bad bacteria to good bacteria, that ratio has crept in the wrong direction. When you trim it down and you get a healthier microbiome, you absorb thyroid hormone better, right? So all of a sudden, the 100 micrograms of levothyroxine is too much, right? And a lot of times in the cases of patients who may be on smaller doses of thyroid replacement, they may not need it at all anymore, right? And so we find that improving the gut is really just a very practical, easy way to help our patients who have thyroid problems.
Okay, brilliant. And kind of thinking about how we can start to understand what gut issues might be contributing to that unique individual's sort of thyroid dysfunction. Are there any tests that you kind of are go-tos for you? Do you do it more sort of based just on symptom and history?
We've been doing this a long time. And so quite honestly, I very rarely test the GI anymore. I've done enough GI map tests and GI 360s and stool cultures and ovine parasites and fecal calprotectins that once you've seen enough of those, you kind of know what a patient's going to have, and you know, more importantly, what to do next. And so there are very few times that I'm doing stool testing these days. We're going by the clinical symptoms first and foremost, because we believe strongly that doctors need to be better at listening to patients. They need to stop getting distracted by numbers on a page. And one of the problems in functional medicine is that doctors are kind of chasing numbers around on a paper rather than listening to their patient and listening to their patient's response to the treatment you gave them. And that's how you get them better. It's not pushing the numbers around. And so what we do is we've set up our system so that we are really honing in on what symptoms do you have, and did the treatment I give you make you better or not? If it didn't, I'm not giving you the right thing, or I'm treating the wrong problem. If it did, okay, we're going to do more of that, right? That tells us we're on the right track. And so we find that a lot of testing distracts from that listening process and that process of really, really closely listening to the symptom response. So,
Yeah.
so that's our contribution to try to simplify the field. Can we spend less of their money and get them better quicker by doing a better job on the front end?
Yeah. No, it's refreshing, I think, to hear ultimately. Are there any, while we're sort of on this kind of theme of the connections between gut and thyroids, is there anything else that you want to mention before we sort of deepen our inquiry in regards to what connects the two, or what might be in the middle that the gut influences and therefore that influences thyroid functional health?
Well, the piece I think is most exciting and encouraging is probiotic therapy. And we have a number of studies now showing the benefit of probiotic therapy on thyroid hormones and thyroid function itself. And so multiple lines of evidence are showing that probiotic therapy improves thyroid absorption, probably because it is changing that dysbiosis I mentioned earlier. But this is just one of those low-hanging fruit layups, right? That we initiate on so many patients and see really nice benefit. And so the point here that I'd like people to know is that oftentimes when probiotics are suggested, in my experience, that they might have tried a little bit of this probiotic off the shelf, or they may have tried this version or this species. And we find that this is a common miss. What we advocate is using a broad diversity of multiple classes of probiotics at once, and usually working up to the highest dose a patient can tolerate without symptoms. Because time and time again, this is improved patient outcomes in multiple domains, right? Their thyroid functions get better, their GI symptoms get better, skin gets better, joint pain gets better. And so when I say multiple classes of probiotics, I mean typically a lacto-bifido blend, a yeast called Saccharomyces, and a soil-based species, the Bacillus species. We have a product that we call triple therapy, right? All three mixed into one packet. Yeah. And it's a treatment that's simple, but is just profoundly impactful. We'll see oftentimes if we start patient on an appropriate diet and lifestyle and probiotics alone, their TPO antibodies drop, right? TPO antibodies, being the marker of autoimmune thyroiditis, the most accurate measure for how much is the immune system actually attacking the thyroid gland, right? And so we love probiotics and we use them a lot. And the evidence is growing in the scientific community that this is a really beneficial treatment to improve outcomes.
Brilliant. Yeah, you kind of answered the question I was going to actually ask around sort of this, I guess not debate, but this kind of concept that we can take a more broad spectrum approach with our probiotics. I got once heard in a conference, they sort of referred to this as the scattergun approach or the sniper approach. So using a single strain probiotic for like a very specific reason that's got evidence behind it for X, Y, and Z. Is there any place from a kind of, I guess, a thyroid perspective? Do we have data yet where single strain organisms have been investigated, or are we still kind of saying this triple impact?
This is such an interesting topic. I'm so glad you asked this. From my perspective, there is no place for single strain management with probiotics.
Okay.
And it's very easy to think that this is the right approach, because the way randomized controlled trials are set up is we want to evaluate one treatment on a condition. And so the scientific evidence is skewed towards, okay, let's see what Lactobacillus reuteri does in IBS. Let's see what this streptococcal species will do. Let's see what this particular strain of bacillus will do with zearalenone toxin and mold toxicity. So we have all these examinations of single strain, right? And so we say, this single strain works in this condition. Clinically, that doesn't hold up. And this, I learned this with patients coming in with signs of histamine intolerance. Should we maybe tell your audience a little bit more about what that may be?
Yeah.
There's a constellation of symptoms and a pattern of reactivity to certain foods that will lead a clinician to think, oh, geez, this patient may have a histamine intolerance. And there are, the kind of thinking is that you need to manage this with certain probiotics that may produce less histamine than other probiotics. And so there's a list of probiotics that you can get online if you Google that are specific for histamine. And I tried this with patients. I said, oh, that sounds like a good idea. That seems reasonable. Here's a paper showing that this probiotic species individually should have less histamine than the other one. And I had this patient with anxiety and rashes and food intolerance and joint pain and brain fog and diarrhea. And I think they have histamine intolerance. Let's try these specific histamines. I didn't see any difference in carefully giving just the histamine probiotics compared to when I gave broad spectrum probiotics. And furthermore, when I gave a bigger diversity of probiotics, patients got better. I think that this is somewhat, we can get prideful in our scientific understanding and go too far ahead of ourselves. I think when we think that we can outsmart the gut and the immune system with a single nutrient or single probiotic, it's a little bit prideful. And we are better served shotgunning, right? Covering all of our bases, because there's a million things we don't know about any individual strain, right? We're learning stuff all the time. And so the better approach, in my opinion, is to shotgun blast as many as you can in there and cover your bases.
Excellent. Okay. That's a really helpful way to think about it, I think. And what you say there around sort of titrating the dose until really symptoms may exacerbate. So you're getting the maximum dose that someone can tolerate ultimately.
Yeah, more so. So I'll say that probiotics are extremely benign, and I rarely see problems. And so it's not the case that if I take the dose to a certain point, everyone's going to have symptoms. Yeah. It's more that generally patients do better on the higher dose range than the lower dose range, all things considered. Every patient is different, right? So I'm going to treat my patient with IBS for a decade, right? Very different than a mold toxic patient. They'll need a different feel and different approach. But generally, the rule is that the higher dose of probiotics you can feed your patients, the quicker they're going to get better, and the better other treatments will work.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the next question that comes to mind, sort of thinking about our listeners who are going to be fascinated by what you've already said around triple probiotic therapy, which is something I've mentioned a few times, I think, on the podcast before, because Dr. Ruscio has really kind of been a promoter of this kind of concept and this protocol. Mm-hmm. We're going to have a lot of people potentially struggling with SIBO, for example. And a common question that we get from our customers, and I guess a common question generally is, if I've already got a bacterial overgrowth, should I be taking a probiotic? Because is that not just adding bacteria to this environment? So are you happy just to kind of share your thoughts and experience?
Yes, because we get this all the time in the clinic, and it's one of those things that the more times I can answer this, the better, because we just need people to learn this, right? So there is an outdated way of thinking that SIBO, you don't want to feed SIBO by giving probiotics, right? If the problem is an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, why would you add more bacteria? The answer is twofold. Most importantly, it works. Patients who have been struggling with SIBO, when you give them triple probiotic therapy, they get better. Just time and time again, hundreds upon hundreds of times. We see this all the time in our clinic. We're going to be publishing data supporting this. We've got research collection going on to support this. And just clinically, this works, right? Once you've done it dozens of times and just see the breath test going down time and time again, you know it works. And so ultimately, that's the thing that is most important to me, is I just want my patients to be better. And so I really don't care about a theory as long as they're getting better. That's the first piece. The second piece, I think, is this is a slight understanding about how probiotics work in SIBO. And the best understanding I have is that the probiotics are working as mini antibiotics. They're antimicrobial in and of themselves. And the idea here is that when you give a probiotic, the majority of these are dead on arrival to the stomach acid. And then the rest are going to die in contact with the bile and digestive enzymes. And so you're not giving a whole bunch of living organisms that are going to be able to populate the gut. And we know this from a couple of lines of evidence that you can change the microbiome by giving probiotics, but this effect is short-lived. When you stop giving the probiotic, that the microbiome will shift back. But what I think is happening is that broken up probiotics, pieces of the cell wall, pieces inside of the probiotic, protein fragments are acting antimicrobially to remove the SIBO, to remove the inappropriate dysbiosis. The other way I think that they're happening is that they're toning and training the immune system. This is what a good piece of bacteria looks like, and we should be kind to this type of bacteria. We should instead focus our firepower on the Klebsiella and the other, guys that we think might be causing more problems in the gut. So, number one, it works. There's just so many cases that have come in and they've said, doc, I've been on oil of oregano and berberine and neem, right? I've done elimination diets and SCD diets, and I've done biphasic diets. And then I've been treated with neomycin and rifaximin, and you can imagine the list goes on and on and on, but they're still sick. Time and time again, when you simply stop, put them on triple probiotic therapy, give them an appropriate diet, doesn't need to be super strict, right? They start improving. And then when they start improving, that probiotic therapy acts as a foundation so that when you circle back and you do want to give them herbal blends, oregano, whatever antimicrobial treatment, it's going to work better. And the beauty here is that we know from multiple lines of infections that when you give antibiotics plus probiotics at the same time, the antibiotics work better, right? So there are very well done studies with H. pylori, right? And when you give probiotics at the same time as the conventional quadruple therapy that's pretty classic to give for H. pylori, you get better cure rates. The same thing happens with SIBO in the natural world, right? Pimentel has shown that if you give probiotics with rifaximin, right? Oh, I think it's Pimentel. Oh. Okay, yeah. If I'm wrong, email Alex. Don't email me. The fact remains, though, that when you give probiotics with rifaximin, right, the clearance rate goes up, and we see this among multiple different infections. And so this is a pretty good piece of evidence to go by.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Probiotics first and foremost, and then it helps the other treatments work better. Is the upshot.
Okay, so that is a super interesting point. And I think, as you said, from your clinical experience, it's the same our end in regards to it's probably the most common question we get when people have been sort of diagnosed with SIBO. And what you mentioned around, I guess, two things. One, which is evidence suggests that when you stop a probiotic, within a few days, sometimes that microbiome is returning to its sort of initial state. And the other one that triple probiotic therapy seems to be such a successful intervention. There's a really interesting paper. It was in Nature's Review in 2017. And I remember that just because I've done a recent sort of post on this, but they spoke about a dysbiotic resilient microbiome. This idea that obviously a resilient microbiome is one that can bounce back from a perturbation like a course of antibiotics or whatever it may be. They spoke about a resistant microbiome being this concept of how much does it take to shift the microbiome into a different sort of state. And they spoke about a stable microbiome, the idea that a healthy, diverse microbiome is one that is stable to some degree, at least at its core, over an extended period of time. And then they talked about the dark side of a resilient microbiome, whereby sometimes people may develop this dysbiotic microbiome that is very hard to shift. And I'm wondering whether when we're using either a low dose probiotic, maybe a single strain probiotic, it's just not a potent enough intervention to recalibrate and put it back into a healthy symbiotic state. Does that kind of...
I agree completely, because we see that pattern clinically all the time. A patient comes in and they say, well, my doc put me on some Culturelle or some Align, or I've been taking, this particular probiotic blend. And we say, okay, let's try something a little different, right? And so when we simply bump the dose, in many cases, we see a clinical effect. And I think that that's the most important signal that we can go by as clinicians, right? And so I would agree completely that oftentimes my suspicion when I hear you review that study in my mind is number one, the patients that they were looking at in the microbiome, no one was doing lifestyle work. And this is a huge miss in as much as integrative and functional medicine talks about lifestyle, we see time and time again, patients coming in with untreated sleep apnea or horrible lifestyle practices, or drinking 2 glasses of wine because it's got polyphenols in it, right, every night, and thinking that that's going to be appropriate to heal their gut, or they're simply working, 60 hours a week, right? They're just beating themselves into the ground, or they are doing CrossFit 6 days a week, right? And in between, they're trying to raise a family and work 2 jobs, and they're wondering why their microbiome hasn't shifted with probiotics. And so sometimes our job is to say, I think you're overtraining. I know it's good, or fasting is good for you, but I'm not sure that you're in a place where fasting 4 days a week is going to really move the needle. Or yes, I know that you've read that the carnivore diet can be curative for arthritis, but I think that you've caused some problems here. And so sometimes it's simply just listening and making sure that the lifestyle is appropriate. Then add the probiotics. Right. Sometimes it's a matter if the patient comes in and their lifestyle is really quite excellent. They're not going overboard. They're taking care of themselves, but they haven't fallen into some of the traps, right? And they just need to bump up the probiotics. And then some patients, it's simply a matter of maybe they're on lifestyle and they've done probiotics, but they need guidance to go the other step of the way. Maybe these are patients who need some restorative or reparative treatments, right? These are the patients who they've kind of gone the natural route and they've been on herbal antimicrobial after herbal antimicrobial, 6 rounds of parasite cleanses, candida cleanses, and berberine, for months and months and months. And their gut is just kind of a burned out wasteland, right? And they need some fertilizer, right? Yeah. They need some rest. And so some of those patients, you need to take a pivot and just heal them, right? Let them rest. Some patients, they've done the lifestyle, the probiotics, and the other pivot they need to make is now they do need some herbal antimicrobials, right? There's some remaining dysbiosis or candida overgrowth that simply needs to be removed. And so these are the things that I think that it takes some variation on getting patients the best result. But ultimately, when you listen to the patient and see if they're making progress or not, if you're on the right track. And you just have to have the humility to say sometimes, I thought that you just needed, some gut rebuild nutrients, maybe some immunoglobulins and glutamine, but we are not making any traction here. We need to stop doing that, right? And try killing things. Right. And so sometimes you just have the humility to say that you maybe you hit the wrong track and you need to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah. I do think there's often it's just lots of moving parts. And sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth to and froing and changing strategy based on where that person's at, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Amazing. So on that note, you've kind of brought in the topic of lifestyle and the fact that obviously we can't ignore whatever might be going on in that person's life. So whether that's stress, whether that's excessive exercise or lack of exercise, etc. From a dietary perspective, thinking about the gut-thyroid axis, maybe someone listening in has a diagnosed sort of thyroid disease. Are there any strategies that you're happy to share, maybe either from a general perspective or just from your clinical research sort of perspective, that are worth being aware of? Not necessarily things that everyone should be doing, but things that can be effective clinically.
So what comes to my mind, I hate to just be controversial, and but what comes to my mind is gluten isn't the devil people make it out to be in the thyroid world. And generally, I treat gluten like ice cream, right? It's not good for you. You're not going to be healthy if you eat it every day, but it's rarely the direct reason why someone has autoimmune disease. I really can think of one case in my career where it was the problem. The biggest enemy from my perspective is processed foods on the patients that I see. Even the processed paleo bars, right? Or the amount of processed foods that we're taking in, and the amount of additives and chemicals and lack of nutrients and lack of fiber that comes in with the processed foods, I think is the biggest problem. So from a dietary perspective, if someone comes in on a regular junky diet, I'm having them reduce sugar and processed foods first and foremost. I usually will ask them to take gluten and dairy out for a period of time, but we're not dogmatic about it, because we don't find that just doing that has fixed patients. It's very rare. And frankly, if you're listening, you should be able to say, this patient has celiac disease, or this patient has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. You put them in a different category, right? But for the other 95% of the population, you don't want to make a single food enemy number one when it's not the major problem.
Right.
So we use paleo diets that's probably the answer to your question. We use paleo diets quite a bit, usually a relaxed paleo diet, right? We're saying remove the processed foods, the sugar, cut down on the baked goods, shift your diet towards more whole foods, fruits, vegetables, seafood, meat, nuts, right? But don't be dogmatic about it, because one of the areas in which functional medicine harms patients is it tells the lie that you have to be 100% perfect on a low salicylate diet, a low oxalate diet, a low histamine diet, gluten-free diet, an AIP protocol. That they say this idea that if you just flip the switch and you're 100% compliant with the diet, that your autoimmune disease will go away. And that's not true. And so what we try to do is you almost have to unbrainwash patients, quite frankly, to some degree. You have to say, hey, look, we are going to improve the quality of your diet, but it doesn't mean you can never eat a piece of bread again. Or if you eat a piece of bread, that you're poisoning your central nervous system with glyphosate and it's too much. That the fear that's built around food can be more of a problem than the food itself. So we use diets all the time, right? We use fasting and elemental diets and paleo and AIP, low histamine. But we try very, very, very hard not to be dogmatic, because that dogmatism hurts patients. Just like you would run away screaming from a physician who said, the only way to treat this problem is PPIs, lowering your stomach acid, and antidepressants, right? That's dogmatic, stupid thinking. The same thing is true for some of the dietary approaches. We're saying, everything that's wrong with a patient is oxalates, and we have to just cut out the oxalates. It just doesn't work like that. So that's my opinion.
No, it's really refreshing to hear. I think there is a lot of dogma in the, whatever you want to call it, complementary integrative functional medicine space. And I think having a, rational, logical, systematic way of working through some of these different interventions is really important. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dr. Ruscio's book was so popular, is because it took such a systematic way of working through things. And by doing that, you understand what's working, what's not working. And it means that you always have a degree of autonomy and awareness over these things. But we certainly see clients and customers whereby either all at once or over a period of time, they've done so many things and are currently doing so many things. You actually you have no idea what's working and what's not working anymore. And you have to kind of take them back to square one to actually figure out what is working, what's not working.
Yes. Let's talk about that for a second. But after talking to Michael almost on a daily basis and working with him for years, one of the areas that I think that we've changed and upgraded thinking on is definitely relaxing the dietary pieces, because it's usually not the primary way someone gets well or not. And so what we tell all of our patients that come into the Ruscio Institute for Functional Medicine is we say, hey, look, we want you on the broadest diet possible to keep you well and keep your symptoms at bay. And we will work with you to expand your diet and see whatever it is. Now, most patients, if they've had IBS for 30 years, they're probably never going to be able to pig out on FODMAPs every single day of their life, no matter how good we get their gut, right? There's going to be a ceiling at which they can eat the FODMAPs, and then they're going to start having irregular stools and bloating and abdominal pain, right? But almost always, as we work with patients, whatever diet we start on, as we introduce the therapies and give their system time to heal, the threshold of foods that they can eat gets higher and higher and higher, right? It's different for every patient, right? But it's just so important that we set that as our expectation coming in. Like, hey, look, we want you on the broadest diet possible. We're going to work with you to get to a better diet. You know, and so some patients I say, hey, look, our goal is for you to be able to go eat a hot dog and a beer with your friends.
Right.
Right. That I think that's really important to keep people with, I think, appropriate mindsets on food and not creating fear. Can we talk about the one thing at a time piece? Because this is so important.
Yeah, of course.
When we work with patients, we give our instructions in a very specific way. We say, hey, look, I want you to do number 1, this, and number 2, I want you to do this, and number 3, I want you to do this. And we write it out in that way. And we say, you have to do things one at a time. And what you're doing is you're looking for your body's response, positive or negative, at each step of the way. It's the only way to do this without ending up on 50 supplements, right? Because I'm sure you see the patients who come in. Before the call, I was telling you about a patient who I counted up the pills that she was taking. She was taking on 90 capsules a day of various B vitamins and adrenal support and iodine and nutrients and herbals and probiotics and on and on and on butyrate and all the rest of it. And we had no idea what was coming or going. We had no idea where to go next. Her system was so confused. And what we do is we usually stop absolutely everything at the beginning of treatment, because you need a clean slate to be able to understand how your body's responding or not. And this is incredibly important. People, I think, have this idea that they need all of these nutrients and supports to keep themselves healthy. And if they stop everything, they're just going to crash and they're already feeling bad. But sometimes the most important thing that we can do as healers is to give them the permission to let go of some of that. Because the truth is, you cannot be healthy if you are worrying about the next pill you have to take 8 times a day. Because every single time you swallow a capsule of pill, you're reconfirming to yourself that you're sick and you need these things to keep yourself well. And so sometimes the most healing thing we can do is say, okay, for 1 week, you're not taking a damn thing. You're taking nothing, right? We're going to start, and anything, if we need any of those pieces you were on, we'll give them to you. But for now, just don't do anything, right? And about 90% of the time, patients have breakthroughs. They feel phenomenally better, right? And it's pretty exciting to see.
Yeah, it's so true. I think a lot of what you say there resonates. I often say to clients, I want you on the most diverse diet possible within the context of your kind of unique food reactivity. So it's kind of saying, look, I don't want you to remove something just for removing's sake. There's got to be a known or strongly suspected reason why we might want to remove this for a period of time. And as you say, this kind of one by one process and sometimes just stripping it back is so important. I must have read this or heard this many years ago, but it was this idea of, you know, every act we do, there's kind of this question of, what is this act telling myself about myself? Like, and what you say there, you know, popping a pill and feeling like you have to do that to get better is kind of reinforcing quite a limited, restrictive concept of what healing is and how we can get well. You know, supplements should be supplementing the rest of the program. They shouldn't be the cornerstone of the program, at least the majority of times.
Supplements are supplemental. And yeah, popping the pills is telling your limbic system, your amygdala, your psyche, your unconscious that you are sick. And that's the idea. And if you're feeding your body the idea that you're sick all day long for years and years and years, you'll be sick. And so sometimes breaking that is super, super important.
Yeah. Do you ever talk with clients around just sort of also just reframing it? So rather than viewing the pill as something which is fixing something that is broken, rather than seeing these things as supporting and kind of cultivating health. So it's just a slight reframe.
I don't. I usually just have, I'm mean. I usually just say, you need to get off all this stuff. And here's another reason why. So when you make a capsule, you've got to put the substance through a machine, and then it's got to fill up the capsule, and then it's got to be, the top's got to be put on, and then it's got to be put into a bottle, right? You have these machines that make the capsules. And so they need what's called excipients magnesium stearate being a very common one, to make the powders flow through the machine so the gears don't get jammed up and clogged, right? So you need to add things to the supplements to make them actually be industrialized into the capsules. Those things can cause leaky gut. So when you're taking 90 capsules a day, it doesn't matter how, even let's pretend you're taking the most healing gut nutrients, right? Taking boatloads of aloe and glutamine and zinc carnosine and on and on and on, right? If you're taking that many capsules, all the gelatin and the additives and the mag stearate can cause a problem in and of itself. So sometimes just, I think a reframe might not be enough because they're actually hurting themselves, right? Or, another way to think about this issue of overtreatment is that supplements can be quite powerful. And sometimes a patient is not in a spot in their healing where it's a good idea to rev up their methylation or to just flood their mitochondria with nutrients to speed it up, right? Or to try to release all the toxins at once. That is not always a good idea. And usually it's not, right? And so when you are sick and you're constantly giving different signals that the body would prefer not to have, sometimes that's not the best way for healing. And so generally less is more, right? Yeah. The least amount of supplements, the broadest diet to get better. And the honest truth is that we need to use supplements to get patients better. If they need herbal antimicrobials, I'm going to have to ask them to take capsules for a few months. And it's very hard to ask them to do that treatment if they're already sucking down 90 capsules. Right. So just to save them some money and sanity, we just have to stop.
Yeah. And here's a good point, because it's not just the excipients, but, I know there's research looking and finding mycotoxins in supplements, including things like milk thistle.
Oh, God. I wasn't aware of that fact, and now I'm horrified.
Yeah, there are some studies that I've seen that look into this, and that's just one example. So I guess, when we do it, it's also a message that we really need to be mindful of the brands that we're using when it comes to this, because, the US and the UK are the same, I think, in the sense that the supplement industry it's not a well-regulated industry. So we have to be very cautious about what we're doing.
And aflatoxins and supplements, I've been made sick by mold toxicity myself, and I treat a lot of patients with mold toxicity. And so that's just a horrible thought. You can't escape some of the problems in today's polluted world. Yeah. I had a patient who was losing her hair. Patches of hair were falling out, lots of fatigue, joint pain, skin problems. And the problem ended up being thallium toxicity from her organic spinach.
Oh, wow.
So she was eating lots of spinach and smoothies. I believe she was kind of 6 cups a day generally. So quite a lot, but assuming, and I had assumed prior to this point that organic spinach was the way to go, but I'm seeing more and more thallium toxicity in the US food supply is the only place I can imagine where it's coming. I don't know if this is fertilizer or runoff water, but I'm seeing higher levels of thallium. And for this patient, was causing hair loss. And we stopped the spinach. She got better. We had to give her binders and other supportive treatments as well. But the main piece there was that we live in a very poison, toxic world. And so we need to be very careful about what we put into our body.
Yeah. I had to do a Instagram live last week for a coffee company that I'm sort of associated with. And it was all about sort of the nasties that can be found in coffee. So pesticides, mycotoxins, heavy metals. And it is scary and a little bit heartbreaking when you do a bit of a deep dive into the research around the health effects of pesticides and things like this, especially obviously the farmers who are being exposed to kind of vast quantities of these toxins.
Oh, God, yeah.
So yeah, it's horrible. But as you say, in things like water runoff, and just the fact that so many of these things are just saturated within our environment, it's becoming increasingly hard to limit our exposure. And I think makes it even more important that we've got a diverse, resilient microbiome that we know can help detoxify some of these things.
Oh man, you're speaking my language, Alex. That's exactly it. What are the things that we can do with the least amount of fuss, right?
Right.
What is the most practical way? And optimizing your diet optimizing your microbiome. These are straightforward. I mean, very easiest things to do, and probably will give people the most bang for their buck compared to a lot of strategies. And that's what we find clinically again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Mather, is there anything that you would like to finish with? Anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to cover or just sort of reinforce?
Just that as the medical director for the Ruscio Institute, I'm exceedingly proud of what we're doing. I love working here, and I would invite anyone who likes what I'm saying to come work with us. We're producing research showing that our model and our methods work. We try extremely hard to give cost-effective and practical recommendations that patients can follow. We work really hard at incorporating research into our findings. So we're constantly updating our protocols and our methods based on scientific evidence. And, I'm training just a bunch of exceptionally sharp, amazing clinicians. And so we'd be happy to take care of patients. That's what we love to do. And so that's what we're here for. It's the Ruscio Institute.
Perfect. So is that the RuscioInstitute.com? Where can people find more and contact?
Yep, that's exactly it. RuscioInstitute.com. It's RUSCIO.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Mather, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real joy to speak to you about the gut-thyroid axis and to hear your kind of experience both in the research but clinically as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.